I tried doing a little research on you because I wanted to kind of understand what your background was. I think you kind of understand mine, right? I've been in sort of body work and both between massage therapy, craniosacral therapy, and functional movement work. I did a lot of rehab work on the movement side, but also a lot of sort of postural correction work and recovery type work. And there's always this crossover between the sort of physical, emotional, and beyond that tends to go on when people go through those processes. So I'm guessing you have some of that background as well.
I do, yes. So whether it's kind of coming out of a background of integrated manual therapy, so doing hands-on work, and then extensive training and practice in craniosacral therapy, and that really became a passion of mine for a couple of decades.
Did you
And
teach too at some point, right?
I did, yep. Yep, I taught kind of episodically throughout my 35 years roughly of
Okay.
doing this, but I spent a good chunk of time teaching biodynamic craniosacral. And then, for me, just a lot of dynamics, but that all of that kind of morphed to bioelectric medicine, and that kind of brought together a passion for me of the body and technology,
Yeah.
and then has led me in that direction. And you know, I still see some bodywork clients, but it is now a very small part of my week over
Yeah.
against
Yeah.
the
So,
other
so
side. But
can you explain where that moment was where you shifted from the manual therapy into this idea of working with the bioelectric body?
yeah, so I think it's helpful maybe to like a bit of history. So you know computers came out when I was very young, and I don't even know, like 4, 5, 6, someplace like that, right? So
Yeah.
it was very new and somewhat rare. And also add in that I'm born and raised in Canada, and
Okay.
Canada's always 20 years behind the U.S. So um, and so maybe I was a little late in the whole curve compared to if I was here in the U.S. But I had a very early fascination with computers, and I wrote my first software, like wrote and sold my first software at age 15,
Oh, wow.
and was very much into that, and it was presumed that that's what I was going to do was computers, and then opted not to do that, went into healthcare, and then ultimately my journey into healthcare in a more academic setting led into body work, and pursued that. So, but all the way along parallel, I just had this more personal interest in technology. So that
Hmm.
was running parallel to me working in healthcare and kind of business and building clinics and all of that.
Yeah.
And so there was that predilection was already in there. And then so I had, in one of my big clinics, I had somebody come in, a practitioner who did bioelectric medicine. And so I thought, well, that was interesting, but it didn't, I was like, well, sure, I've got lots of things, whatever. But he was doing aesthetics, so microcurrent aesthetics. And I would
Hmm.
see his clients, before and after sessions. And after seeing, 8, 9, 10, 20 people come in and out of his room, I literally one time walked over to one of his clients and was like, I'm really sorry, pardon me, I've got to ask a question. What happened in there? I
Hmm.
said, the
Yeah.
transformation from when you came in to now that you're walking out is astounding.
Just brightness in their face and their eyes and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, yeah, very much. I mean, change in skin, but change in continence, like just
Hmm.
how
Yeah.
how they were, like they were like radiant, right? And I was like,
Yeah.
what is going on in there? And so then, she was kind enough to tell me the process, and then I started to spend more time with, and the person that was Delaney, who was at the time fairly well known in the microcurrent aesthetics world. And so that was kind of my first real in my clinic personal experience with it. And then just out of random happenstance, the a practitioner who practices more on the healthcare side, not on the aesthetic side, healthcare side,
Yeah.
who again was a very well-known, very popular in bioelectric medicine, lost her clinic that she was practicing in, needed a place. I had space. She moved in, and I truly witnessed miracles happening.
Yeah.
And it was, this lady was amazing. She would have a waiting room full of people all day long. She would run as many rooms as she could get in the clinic. And at the time I had a 10-room clinic. If she could get 8 of those rooms, she would have 8 clients going,
Wow.
8 machines going, and she would just see people basically until I said, like, we have to close the clinic. Like, it would be midnight, and I would have to say to a room full of people, you have to go now.
Wow.
Come back in the morning. And we just saw amazing things happen. And that was really when I said, like, okay. Like, by that time, I'd been around practicing for probably 20 years.
Okay.
And had not seen what I was witnessing.
So this is how long ago? For like, this is like 15 years, 20 years ago?
About 15 years ago.
Okay.
That I had this experience with Suzanne.
Yeah.
And so then, basically I just asked Suzanne, "Is like, will you teach me?" Like,
Yeah.
And so I kind of apprenticed with Suzanne for maybe a year. Then she was able to kind of get back to like her clinic. The situation there had sorted itself out, and she was able to kind of move back into her original place. But so I bought my own equipment and continued the practice, and that just pulled me into this whole area of bioelectric medicine.
Mm-hmm.
And the more I've learned about it, the more I've acquired the equipment and the training and the skills and the knowledge base to be able to practice it in a more diverse and at a larger scale.
Was it hard for you in terms of the transition between? Did you start using it with clients you had already been working with? Was it hard for them to transition from having the touch and the manual part of things to, working with was it microcurrent that you started with, or what was your first?
Yeah. So the first equipment was a very particular form of microcurrent equipment, which is still novel in the bioelectric space.
Yeah.
So Acuscope and Myopulse, which it does biofeedback, so it's reading and writing and reading and writing. So it's a very unique piece of equipment. But yeah, so for me, it was really integrating it into what I already did. And then over time, seeing like this equipment is moving people forward faster than what I was doing on my own. And then more and more I transitioned into seeing that it could be a stand-alone modality that deserved more of a place than just 15 minutes or something integrated into a cranial session or a myofascial session or whatever. And so really then started to build it into its own treatment, and now still use it in that way in the clinic. And actually what I've done is now the vast majority of my clients that are bioelectric medicine treat at home with home devices. And it's much more effective because they can do it every day.
Yeah.
They can do it multiple hours a day. It's more efficient in the sense of money. Like they can do a week worth of treatment for the cost of one in-clinic visit.
Yeah.
So for them, and they don't have to come to the clinic.
Yeah.
So it's become a very effective, efficient way to deliver healthcare is at-home bioelectric.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, I got to watch you did talk at a conference recently, and the second time I've heard you talk. So I've been getting more and more interested. I didn't do as many conferences the last 5 years because of pandemic stuff and whatever. But the one thing I was wondering after seeing you talk is sort of thinking about it as model of care kind of thing of. Is it sort of like a program then? So, you're not like renting out equipment, or I suppose you could rent out the equipment, but you can also sort of build it into like a program. You have a pretty good sense now, probably based on what their challenge is, how long this program will be. So, is that kind of how you're working?
Absolutely. So we'll sell a device or rent a device, and if we rent it, it can be rent to own. So if somebody rents and decides to purchase,
gotcha. Okay.
Purchase. So we really try and make it affordable as part of the, kind of efficiency of healthcare. How do we make it affordable for people, accessible? So I'll start off with a consult, virtual consult, get a sense of the person, what's going on. Are we talking about an acute injury? So maybe it's a professional athlete that has a stress fracture in a foot. So that's the thing we need to heal. So we get them equipment. They use it for 4 weeks. They're back in action. They send the equipment back.
Gotcha.
It could be that. So just an acute episode, or it could be more chronic. Like I treat a lot of macular degeneration, and so that's a chronic degenerative condition. And so we presume the person is going to need this treatment, for the rest of their life. So they're more likely to buy the device and then, treat for whatever the treatment plan is. Maybe, month 1, it's 2 hours a day. And by month 5, they're down to 15 minutes every other day. Okay. And that becomes kind of their chronic maintenance. But yeah, all kinds of different models and all kinds of different devices based on the person, the condition, their budget. I like to say everybody has the same 4 resources: time, money, energy, and attention.
Yeah, totally. That's the way I work too.
Yeah. And so the best treatment plan is the treatment plan a person can and will do. Yeah. So that's what I try and do, is build a plan that they can not only afford financially, but that they will do in terms of time and attention.
Yeah, and knowing too that if the sooner we can really treat an acute condition, that already takes down some of the time. But figuring out sometimes how to budget that, because on the front end you need more care, and then it kind of over time that kind of gradually starts to fade too.
Yep. Yeah, and then since the devices are really about vitalizing the bodily being. They're not, they're not anti-pathology, right? So I'm not sending a digital antibiotic. Right. We're sending something that is actually vitalizing.
Yeah.
And so for the person, like whether it's an acute condition that they're treating, maybe a post-surgical, something we're optimizing post-surgical recovery from a knee replacement, that person might decide to buy that device even though they're fully recovered from their knee surgery, but now they're just going to use it to augment their health across multiple domains. Yeah. And so having that sense that what we're really talking about is less about disease care model and more of a health care model, and it is more like diet and exercise.
You're right.
Yeah. That.
And that I feel like that is the future. I think, and I wish that body work were part of that future of medicine as well. It just doesn't seem like it's going to be integrated as quickly as something like this. I feel like the insurance-based, model would be more happy about using technology, although they might not be happy that you're selling them something that's going to take care of them long term.
Well, so that is part of the tension, right? And I long held that when we are going to see a change is when pharmaceutical companies started to see that there was a financial reason to get into something like bioelectric medicine. Yeah. And that one, they would see it as, here's a place to make money. They're highly motivated by that. Yeah. But also, when they started to notice that bioelectric medicine was cutting into their profit stream, that they would have an additional incentive to replace that revenue that they were losing through sale of medications, because people were using bioelectric medicine instead of medication. Yeah. And that's exactly what has happened. Yeah. We are seeing now pharmaceutical companies getting into the bioelectric space. And, as much as we might say, or I might say about, pharmaceutical industry, what I will say is they know how to do research, and so having good, solid, well-funded, well-designed studies has pushed bioelectric medicine further than it had been in the previous 100 years. So that's been a net benefit to humanity. Yeah. It's just unfortunate that it's going to keep the revenue in that same sector and not distribute it.
It's so funny that you say that, because I was just thinking about, so I was a musician before getting into this career, and somewhere in the 90s, I realized I wasn't going to be part of the Rolling Stones or something, not going to ever make that kind of money. So as things started moving to digital and the streaming services and stuff started kind of coming up, it was pretty clear that musicians weren't going to make profits off but few musicians actually made money off of the records that they sold anyways until they got to a certain level. So but it feels very much like that, like medicine can almost kind of start to shift into this model where you can have access to better self-care and maybe pay, like as we would for a streaming service, for something that has a technology component to it, and that we can even interact with professionals through technology as well, which should, potentially bring down the premiums. I don't know what it does for the jobs of the healthcare people. I don't know. It's probably a very scary conversation to get into, but do you understand where I'm going with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to the degree that there's been adoption, that's what we see, right? Mm-hmm. We see the more access, better outcomes, less of a burden on the healthcare system, and we kind of acknowledge the people side of the healthcare system. They're overworked.
Yeah. Right.
And so anything that makes everybody in the chain of care, makes their day easier, is a net benefit to the human side of it, right?
Yeah, right.
So patients are happy because they have better health outcomes. Providers are happy because it's less burdensome to move that patient through the care process.
Yeah.
And we can, it shows that it can reduce costs. So it's very much across the board, a win as bioelectric medicine moves more into the healthcare system proper.
Yeah.
But like so much that happens in any big system, adoption is slow.
You're right.
And so still people are going to find much more access to the benefits of bioelectric medicine outside the system. And that's likely to be true for some unknown period of time, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years.
Yeah.
Because that system just changes slowly.
Yeah. And people are starting to, even from the patient side, people are starting to realize that the healthcare system is not really for health; it's really to deal with disease. And in acute situations, it's nice to have. Although sometimes the metrics are a little strange for me, like in terms of what they decide they're going to do for an infection or whatever. When there's I think some better medicine that could be used that's not so aggressive or not such hard medicine. I feel like you and I are in a little bit more of a soft medicine field, and we also, I got into working the way that I did and decided to stay in this because it just felt like there was a lot less risk in terms of the short-term and long-term effects that it could have for somebody. So and that kind of leads into what I want to get into a little bit more with you. And I am curious to learn more about Bhaki Brain Health Clinic, but also and the kinds of things that you treat. But I really want to pick your brain a little bit about concussion because it's something that I'm seeing more and more of. But we'll kind of finish with that. So tell me the kind of range of things that you end up working with bioelectric medicine.
Yeah, that's a great question. So
I'm sure it's very broad, right?
It's very broad because, like, if we just talked about brain health, what we say in the clinic, it's a little tongue-in-cheek, but also true. When people ask, like, who's your market, who's your patient base, and we say anybody with a brain.
Yeah.
And
the idea of the brain is even changing now with the gut and glia and all these things where we're like,
right.
Okay, well, maybe it's more than just that thing in your head.
Yeah, absolutely. It's nested in an ecosystem. Yeah. And we need as providers to be mindful that it is nested in an entire system and not to reduce, in my case, like I could become brain centric and reduce everything down to brain function. but fortunately, I feel like my background, and just personal predilection, because I left pre-med because of all of the reasons of I thought it was, kind of dehumanizing and conceptually limiting.
Even in Canada?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And so the model didn't feel right. And when I ended up in more of a holistic training program, I just immediately, even though I conceptually didn't know any of this, I was 20, whatever, I didn't know.
Yeah.
It was just like ambling through life.
Right.
But what I knew was pre-med didn't feel good. And when I landed in more of a holistic curriculum, it felt right. It resonated. So I feel like some part of me was just wired that way from the beginning. So I'm not too worried that I'm going to become brain-centric and reductionist.
Right.
But I do, there are times when I talk about the brain, and if somebody just heard me having that conversation, they would think, oh, like he thinks the brain is everything. It's like, no, absolutely, you're right. We got to look at the gut and so many things. We've got to be in the biopsychosocial space and accounting for all of those domains with, equally across any individual client that we're dealing with. We have to look at biopsychosocial all the time.
Of course.
So now I will talk about brains.
Okay.
But no, so it is, we say everybody with a brain, and the reason we say that is it doesn't matter if somebody is like peak performance, right? So we do peak performance brain health. So these are people who would not, do not show up reporting a problem. Mm-hmm. And we put them through our tests, and they test, at the top of every metric. And from a kind of pathological perspective, I could say to this person, why are you here?
Yeah.
Your brain is Olympic quality. What do you want from me?
Yeah.
But, and I have had these conversations with people, is even the brain that is, above average on every metric can be improved. And that's kind of the point of why we say anybody with a brain, because it doesn't have to be a problem that we're solving. It could be just taking optimum and making optimum better.
Yeah, and it even kind of challenges the notion of what we're trying to build into health. Like we've thought about exercise as being sort of this, optimal way of supercharging our physical and electrical bodies, but we also know that challenging ourselves with word puzzles and doing all these different kinds of things can really and being a musician, I've read so many different articles on health about what it does to brains and how it lights up all these areas that don't get sort of moved otherwise, even just listening to it, but playing it and having to be involved in the math of it and the listening and interacting and all these different things that it makes you do does something to brains. And everybody that I meet in medicine who have musical background, they're my favorite people to work with because they're good listeners, for one. They also they look at things from a much bigger perspective, and they're not so locked into one way of looking at something, and so that it brings up all those kinds of things. If we start thinking about how we're engaging children in terms of like optimizing them for their lives, really thinking about the brain health or neuro-bioelectrical health from an early age is probably going to both benefit their physical body and all their systems, but also increase their potential for joy in some way too.
Absolutely. And I was just talking this morning with a mom of a 3-year-old who's shown through his early years some developmental delays, and so they're using speech therapy to try and address some of that.
Yeah.
And we talked about there are some other things that they could be looking at, like some of the infantile reflexes that don't necessarily automatically convert as they're supposed to do.
Right.
And if they don't, a child, but not even a child, you can be 50 and still struggling with a deficiency that's related to an infantile reflex that didn't move to the next stage of the reflex.
Right.
And so even adults can benefit greatly from doing this neural reflex work, which is really repatterning the primordial reflexes that we're born with and are supposed to go through evolutionary stages. So, so very much getting the brain optimized makes a difference, an incredible difference in children, because it's going to affect how they develop.
Yeah.
Right? Like, we can help a 60-year-old, but what we can't do is give them those 60 years as a do-over of who they could become if their brain had that extra capacity. And now that we know this from a neuroplasticity, cognitive development standpoint, we can say, working with children, that there's an urgency to optimize as young as possible.
Yeah.
Because of what they won't get if we don't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And because we're, in the last, 100 years or so, we're living so much longer. Mm-hmm. So, we might physically live longer, but, from a bioelectric standpoint, I bet, there's a peak somewhere that's not very old and starts to decline. And so what are we doing to manage those things? Because that's that, again, talking about joy, or talking about, how we stay vital, that can really change, an entire, biosocial system right there.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I just heard a fascinating talk, which I appreciated the way that the guy reframed this to not living longer, but dying longer.
Yes.
And really talking about what you're saying is, like, someplace for all of us, we hit kind of a peak of kind of function, right? And then we started to decline, and then that declines to something like, physical death. And his point was, like, we've pushed out the end point, but we haven't really done much to move that other point, which is, when do we hit our peak?
Right.
We haven't really pushed that closer to the end point. And that's a really, interesting perspective around this. A lot of the stuff that's happening in the longevity right now has really always been about, well, instead of dying at 70, I want to die at 90. But if the quality of life between 70 and 90 is lousy,
right,
it's arguable about the net benefit of that choice, right? And so it really is becoming now this more intelligent conversation about optimizing function more so than just the endpoint.
Yeah, right? I was as you were saying that, I was even thinking about the way that we've thought about longevity for such a long time. Also is about supplements that help the, hair and skin and nails and all these things, but we don't really think about that bioelectric part, which is, the high functioning that basically is going to, it improves our state of well-being, so mental health wise, and especially at a time when technology, has its ill effects on us. The things that are popping up in my practice, at least, as far as I'm treating more young people than I probably ever have, especially teenagers, because of, probably what's going on with their social networks becoming tied to technology, and the fact that we as parents don't even get to interact or see visually what's going on with people with our kids in these ways. It's really hard to get a gauge on how much that's affecting them in a biopsychosocial setting, but that we can probably, if we had some sort of regular way of sort of, tuning in, checking in, being able to see what's going on from a bioelectrical level, we'd have a pretty good gauge probably on what's happening with our kids and why they might be having some depressive episodes or struggling with anxiety, those kinds of things that I see a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is a great area, for us to talk about a little bit of kind of the overlap of what we do. So yes, I mean, statistically we see, the mental health incidents of mental health concerns just skyrocketing, and the biggest demographic is, something like 11 to 14-year-old girls, right? It's just like the major increases there, but we see it both male female, but at a younger and younger age, the numbers are growing, in a more alarming fashion, and a lot of conjecture about why. But I think you're generally right about how technology has kind of disrupted our developmental process.
You're right,
and we've not figured it out yet.
And as parents, we're not sure how to parent it yet. I mean, and this happens with every generation, but this one has happened so fast that I think
and so completely.
And every age of culture too. It's not just children. So
yeah, there's just nothing historically that compares to this. Like, I can't say to my kids, well, you whatever, or to my grandkids, because you and I didn't go through anything like this.
Right.
Yeah, and that's the why is this a global epidemic? Global in the sense of every civilization that had this technological revolution. Because if we look in societies that didn't, they've not changed. Their statistics are stable. It is when we look in the cultures where they have gone through this, that's where you see parity around the world, right? So we have a good control group where there's maybe, say, poverty, where they weren't able to participate in the technological revolution. They didn't have a spike in childhood mental health issues.
It's really interesting to keep that in mind.
For me, doing neuroimaging, one of the things that I am seeing that looks to me like a trend, and there's some growing conversation in this area, but dysregulation in two very particular parts of the brain, which are really the central circuit around self-regulation of body, emotion, feeling, executive function. So, kind of values, rules, planning, right? That whole mix of things that are happening there. That circuit that is like our lived experience is running through that circuit all day long, and we're modifying our bodily function, our physiology, and our behavior based on this circuit, right? And seeing just more and more young folks coming in where that is the primary dysregulation in the brain. That circuit is broken. And if you add to that, we'll get to this, I'm sure, but if you add concussion to that, during this developmental period, especially because there's some statistic, I forget what it is, but younger people who have concussion, their likelihood of engaging in criminal activity, drug use, being imprisoned, all these things goes up by some incredible percentage, and it has to do with all the executive functioning stuff that you're talking about. Correct. Yes. So if you there is kind of a commingling of brain dysregulation that can grow together to produce something less optimal than if there had just been one thing. So a concussion happening into a particular system is different than a concussion happening into a different system. So let's just say a little bit about that. So if somebody has developmental trauma, okay, so you've got a system that already has in it the changes that come from developmental trauma, and then that brain has a concussion, its response is going to be very different than the brain that did not have that developmental trauma and had that concussion. And vice versa. The brain that has had a concussion early in life that then goes on in into a a situation that is particularly distressing, maybe traumatic, that brain will have a less optimal opportunity to navigate that circumstance. So we get these overlapping insults to the nervous system, and they do add up.
Which is what I treat all the time, and it's not just head injury. I mean, these we could call them like second traumas or whatever you want to call it, where when that happens, I forget the term, but it has something to do with these two things sort of firing together, and we see that it's not just 1 + 1, but it actually it's 1 + 1 = 2. It's 1 + 1 = 17 sometimes. You can't explain it to. It's not a rational process in the brain or in the nervous system. It just kind of ends up in that place from autonomic response.
Yep. Yeah, and that could take us into to one of my favorite areas to talk about. Let's do that. But I just want to go back to talking about like this core circuit that we're seeing more consistent across the younger demographic that come in, and we do our neuroimaging, and we're just seeing this pattern more and more frequently. But what happens is when we treat that, when we do, mostly that would be neurofeedback. It could be neurostimulation, but more often be neurofeedback. When we're able to move that circuit back to a more typical functioning, what we see is the report from the person coming in and talking about, making better decisions. Basically, like they have a better sense of themselves, like who they are, but their self-boundary, who others are. So they have the direct experience of like, I'm a somebody, and you're a somebody, and you're different than me, and that there's a relationship, and the relationship has kind of rules and boundaries and do's and don'ts. And for many of the folks that are going through this, like that's a surprise to them. Like the them of 6 weeks ago had no idea of that.
Yeah.
And when you think about it in that way, and then you look at their behavior, and it's like, yeah, you were functioning like somebody who didn't really have a good sense of self.
Yeah.
And so there wasn't a self-care component because you don't have a good sense of self.
Yeah.
You did things that we would kind of say are self-centered or narcissistic or antisocial because you didn't really have a good concept of the other.
Yeah.
So you weren't constraining your behavior under normal social rules. And as those things start to develop, there's just a natural movement towards what we would think of as just more kind of, kind of civil behavior.
Yeah.
And that might be something as simple as a great example of one of my people brought in was they were talking about their driving and their tendency to drive like very fast, like drive 100 miles an hour. And they just had no sense that was bad. Like they knew it was illegal,
right?
But there was no sense that was a really danger to them, that was a danger to other people besides them, that there could be consequences to that their future self might not want to have, and so their present self should modify their behavior so their future self doesn't have the problem that's going to come from that. Right. And although it's like the person is telling me that this is dawning on them as a new way of being in the world, they could marvel at like, how did the me of 4 months ago not know this?
Yeah.
And yet now it's just as clear, in me as it could be. And that's that core functioning of self-regulation that is off in so many people today. And again, if we talk about just this younger demographic, this is one of the things that is getting dysregulated. And when we bring it back, they're in a sense normal.
Right. Well, you know what's interesting is this kind of relates to the thing that you presented at the conference. There was one video that you had where you were talking. It was actually people with memory loss and language challenges, and what I found fascinating about that I feel like it actually relates to this is how these same people were, you had recorded them, before, during, and after treatments, and when they went back and saw their early self speaking, they didn't realize that they were losing language or that they couldn't find words, because they were so in some place in their constitution where they weren't even self-aware enough to understand that they weren't saying the words that they were that were missing from the conversation, which brings up this whole idea of like, we sort of are our current state of neurochemical and electrical existence.
Yeah, absolutely. This phenomena of identity, and how one of the downsides of our adaptability is that we can fairly quickly adapt to a very maladaptive state. So you're referring about one of my dementia folks who didn't, like, moment to moment, really didn't know how much she had lost the plot, like how far off the bubble she was. She had enough of an awareness to know that she needed help, but that was about it. Like, it was just like she came in and she was just like, help me.
Right.
I don't know what's wrong, but something is wrong. And it was really about her observing the external factors of her life, like her work performance was dropping, her household was kind of falling apart, but she didn't have the internal sense of like, it's me because I can't do these things anymore.
Yeah.
It was her seeing the environment around her going, this doesn't seem good. Right. And so, yeah, it's amazing. Like, how can that happen? Yet it absolutely happens. So one of the things, a little tangent we went on before I took us back to this little piece about the core circuit, and some of this idea around kind of bioelectric medicine, and what happens and what's possible, and the nature of kind of change and healing, and even kind of a little bit around identity, because I feel like that plays a part.
Because there are measures too. I mean, when someone comes in with whatever their neural or brain health challenges, whatever you want to call it, we're trying to figure out what the baseline is. We don't always get to know where they were before, so we know what certain kinds of optimal look like, but not everyone's going to reach that level.
Yeah, exactly. We because we see people. The analogy I use for this is a circle, right? So if you draw a circle, and then I ask you, where's the beginning of the circle? Well, you'll point to where you put the pen down to draw the circle and say, well, this is the beginning. But if I show you a circle somebody else drew and say, where's the beginning? Well, you have no idea. Right? And so that's how, as clinicians, that's what our patients are like, clients are like when they come in. They're a process that's already in motion. We don't know the beginning.
Yeah.
And not that there isn't sometimes some help in trying to figure out when did this symptom start, because again, if it's acute, that's easy. I fell down the stairs. Yeah. Got it. Okay. But for many of
we don't get many of those, though, unfortunately.
You don't, exactly. Most people, it's not an acute single thing. Yeah. It's a multivariable process. Yeah. And short of going everything back to birth or past lives, we just can't know. But what we can do is say, here's what we're going to do, is we're going to take you from where you are and move you forward. And we're going to aim towards something that looks like optimal health, optimal functioning, less suffering, more flourishing.
Right.
And move them in that direction, even though we don't know. But it's true that for the most part, we don't know what a person's potential is because we didn't know them before whatever their deficit was.
Right. And our skill, which is, this gets into like, I'm curious to learn a little bit about how you measure things, because you have, but I'm sure you make decisions electrically based on that. But most of us are in a state of, organized dysfunction. And,
yes.
So how do you, our skill is actually to sort of understand we've seen enough optimal. We've seen where something with a certain amount of organized dysfunction can get back to, and then there's sort of micro changes that can sort of happen beyond that, and depending on how much someone really wants to engage or have equipment at home or self-care things that they're doing. But I guess that brings me into what are your units of measurement, I guess, in terms of how you decide, and maybe just to give people a little background on what microcurrent looks like in use, what biofeedback looks like in use.
Sure. Yep. Yeah. So I want to, I don't know. I want to say like maybe expand the conversation or include another aspect that isn't like explicitly in the conversational field right now.
Yeah.
And bring it in, because again, as craniosacral therapists, this is like normal. What I'm about to talk to is normal for us. We participate in this every time we do a session. We have language around it. We have a phenomenology around it. We have techniques, like for us, fish in water, right? But for most, people like Western culture, folks, they have no conception. There isn't a space in the mind to even hold what you and I, take for granted in the sense of a day in the office, right?
Yeah.
And so I want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, that's great.
Because it does go to really answering your question, actually. And so the basically, I'm going to use the word kind of intelligence, right? And often if I say intelligence, we think about the mind, we think about academics. So how good are you in math or language or write an essay or whatever? Think of that. And that's fine. That's a form of intelligence. And we can think about like there's social emotional intelligences. So we've been working culturally to kind of expand. But in many ways, all we talk about is intelligence basically related to the brain, right? Something like IQ, right? That's it. So what I want to talk about is really this idea that is emerging in Western academics, and one of my favorite guys for this is Michael Levin. So his work, Tufts University, and he's working on this theory that he calls TAME, so the technological approach to mind everywhere, right? And basically what he's positing, and not just positing, but proving, and that to me is why I look to him and people kind of in his sphere, is this isn't theory, it's not hypothesis, it's not philosophy, it's not psychology, it's not sociology. They are proving it at the nuts and bolts level, experimentally, and that's how we know it's not a theory or a philosophy, right? Yeah. So this idea that mind isn't just the epiphenomena of the brain, that mind is its own ontological existence in reality, and mind goes all the way down. And in Michael Levin's world, he works primarily in biology, and so you and I work primarily with biology, and so we could say mind goes all the way down to the smallest biological part that we want to acknowledge. But there's plenty of growing research to show that this intelligence goes into chemistry and into physics.
Oh yeah.
Right? So we can see that it isn't just in life that there's intelligence. And so this idea that's again emerging is this idea of what they call agential material. So agential being agency. That if you look at a cell or a tissue or an organelle or an organism, whatever level we want to go to, that material has intelligence. It's an agent. It has volition, right? And so the question becomes like, from a health standpoint, if we start to look at health from this idea of intelligence, what is happening in the intelligence at the level of the cell and the individual cell doing metabolism, so doing ion
communicating
exchange,
with other cells, and
communicating with other cells and the extracellular environment and all of that, and we can go down to genes, and they've shown that gene regulatory networks can show, like they've tested and they've been able to show that a gene regulatory network, they can identify 5 different types of intelligence within a gene regulatory network.
Right.
And that's they've only figured out like 5 ways to test it. If they figure out more ways to test it, we're not saying it only has 5. It's just the smartest people can only come up with 5 ways of querying it, right? So, but to know that a gene regulatory network made up of maybe 6, chemical constituents and their relationships have 5 different forms of intelligence, like that's amazing, right? To know. So when we talk about genetics, and we have this general inherited idea over the last 140 years that genes are destiny, like your genes are fixed things. They're little machines that replicate action. They replicate themselves. They just do that. And it turns out that's not true at all. That's not nowhere near true.
Right.
They can learn, and they can learn bad habits just as well as they learn good habits.
Yeah.
And then we scale that all the way up. Every level of biology has an intelligence. So that idea is emerging, within a Western paradigm that is generally being called bioelectric medicine, and this idea of agential material. Now we could turn and look at, let's just say, kind of the Eastern traditions. It's a catch-all phrase for traditional Chinese medicine,
Ayurveda,
Japanese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, Tibetan medicine, indigenous medicine. Let's get them all in there, so I don't want to leave anybody out. They have built in concepts and practices and processes that already have acknowledged that there's an intelligence.
Yeah.
Right? So
that's just innate, to us as beings, to the planet, the electrical fields, all that stuff.
Yes, and that those populations of people were sensitive enough to perceive that there was this, and then develop techniques to interact with this intelligence. So if we go to Chinese medicine, and this isn't true of like all TCM practitioners wouldn't use this language, but there's a subset that understands, say, something like qi as the intelligence. And the qi isn't just an electrical force, and it's not just a mysterious energetic force that isn't electric the way we think of electricity, but it is just to think of it as a force like gravity or whatever. But to understand it as an intelligence that has capacity to learn and can solve problems in novel ways. That's the definition of intelligence, right? Is the ability to derive novel solutions to problems. That's intelligence. And so that we have in us this intelligence that can solve the problems that we call disease and pathology, and produce something we call health. And so if we admit this in, and then we stop working with the machine, thinking that it's about a something called a cell wall, or something about, there's calcium and there's magnesium and there's an ion pump, and I've got to regulate the amount of magnesium. So think functional medicine, right? And all of a sudden the person is on 18 supplements because they're trying to augment their chemistry, right? To push around, bowling balls at the cellular level, right?
Right.
And then, but scale that up every place, like think surgery, mechanics. Like, we're just going to cut this part off of here and reattach it over here and stitch you back up. And like a machine, we just moved a cable and everything will be fine. Yeah. Right? Like, so we have this across our healthcare, but beyond our healthcare, we have this kind of reductionist, mechanistic perspective that doesn't have in it any space for an intelligence.
Yeah.
And because we have no concept of it, we don't look for it, we don't see it, we don't have a way to interact with it.
Yeah.
The traditions
Yeah.
bring us that and say,
Right.
hey, here's a whole area of reality you might want to consider, and then here's a whole set of tools you could use to interact with that reality that you don't think exists.
Right.
And so what we see emerging in the field of bioelectric medicine is a willingness to admit that as a possibility, do the experiments to find it, having located it, do the experiments to manipulate it, find out that there is a there,
Yeah.
and then do the research to figure out how to manipulate it in a way that you get a beneficial outcome, right? Like on one hand, it's easy to give, an organ cancer, but what's more interesting is curing cancer,
Right.
right? But in some ways, it's easier experimentally to break something than to fix it, right? But we see in bioelectric medicine, and this is one of the things that I think is so meaningful, impactful, is so again, Michael Levin in his lab has shown that you can take a healthy animal, you can induce tumor growth, and then you can make that tumor go away, and you can do all of that by changing the bioelectric field and never touching the genes, the chemistry, the tumor itself physically. You just change the bioelectric field, and you can work with that, and across multiple ways of doing it, not just in cancer. That just happens to be one. But one of his best examples is in a living animal to induce or to inject a cancer gene, so that they show that, like, if you put this in, tumors will develop, the animal will be consumed by cancer, it will die. Okay, so we know that that's what's going to happen. So they'll inject the cancer gene, and then they'll tweak the bioelectric field. And although you can see that cancer gene is expressed, that animal should be developing tumors, it's not. And it's stable across time. And so this is telling us that by what he's doing is working with the intelligence of not letting the kind of dissociation of mind at the cellular level happen that is cancer. So cancer is normal, healthy cells that have been dissociated from the local mind, and they revert back to a single cell organism, and all of the intelligences and needs and desires and goals and aims of a single celled organism, and not a cell within a larger organism where their behavior is constrained by cooperation and collaboration, say, to be a kidney. Right? When those kidney cells dissociate and they go back to being a single cell on their own, they do what they do, which is they take more resources, they multiply faster, all of that, cancer. So this idea of that there is mind at every level, and that it can be interacted with, and then in that it can be interacted with, it can be guided and optimized.
And
so
that's the one thing that I can't help but think about is, we're talking about we start out talking about brain, and then getting into the idea of the mind. This is really a hard. I mean, you and I speak the same language, but this is a really hard one for people to understand. Is what we are trying to get the body, the physical body, to do in terms of recovering from whatever the challenge is to engage the mind. Is that kind of where you're going to here now? Yeah,
exactly. And so one of the things that I like that's kind of emerged out of this relatively new, the conversation goes back a long time, even in the Western academic tradition. But we can think of like Roland Becker and the bioelectric, and his idea of being able to get like a frog to regenerate, because a salamander can regenerate. So a frog is right next to it evolutionarily. So why can't we get a frog to regenerate? And he had the theory, the idea, and did experiments. He just wasn't successful. Well, fast forward to Michael Levin, where he's able to get a frog to regenerate a leg. You know, it's now like do it all day, every day, right?
Right.
And not only regenerate a leg, now that he knows what the algorithm is for getting a frog to grow a leg, he can just say to a frog that has 4 legs, like say to the bioelectric field, grow a 5th leg here. And it will grow a perfectly functional 5th leg wired in. It can use it. It can say grow an eye here. He regrew a brain in a living frog. And
crazy.
Yeah, absolutely, right? So this idea that if we first admit into our consciousness that this is a possibility,
yeah.
Once we know it's a possibility, we can begin to look for it. If we look for it, we can possibly find it. If we can find it, we can interact with it, and we can learn about it, and then we can be in relationship with it. And that's what he has shown, is that he's able to be in relationship with the bioelectric field in an intelligent way and get it to do things that is utterly possible for it to do, but for whatever reasons it doesn't. Like why doesn't the frog regenerate a limb?
Yeah.
We don't know the evolutionary story of the why. We just know it doesn't. But by interacting with the bioelectric field in a specific way, you can turn on that function and get it to regenerate a limb.
Yeah.
So now he's moved on into a mouse model, and they're at a point where they've been able to get a mouse to regenerate about half a limb. They figure they're not that far away from being able to get it, fully completed in a mouse model, and then they want to, move on to human trials. So the goal here is to bring regenerative medicine into full practice in a very real, demonstrable way.
Yeah.
And then one of his other passions is cancer, and this idea of being able to that he can do in animal models is make tumors appear, make them go away. He can turn them on and off at will. How to do that, moving up the evolutionary scale and then eventually in humans. But the main thing here is just that there's this intelligence that we can interact with. And so I want to go back to then craniosacral, right? So in craniosacral therapy, or in osteopathy in the cranial field, we have what we call the inherent treatment plan, right? And that in our client, in their system, is their own embryological blueprint for health.
Right.
And we just believe it's in the system. You can access it. We can interact with that intelligence and bring it back into action.
Right.
And so that can be, there's a lot of possibilities here, but in a session working with a client, it can be tapping into this embryological force about, let's say it's about the original development of the knee, when their knee originally formed in utero, and tapping into that intelligence of what is a healthy knee, what is a normal knee. That is a common way that I would interact with somebody who's coming in who's maybe has a knee problem, would be to engage in those forces and bring them that intelligence back in to help restore function in that knee.
Right.
And so what I'm not doing is anything mechanical.
Right.
I'm not trying to release a tight muscle or release an entrapped nerve or
use force to move it a certain way, or
exactly. Like there's nothing in my brain that is even remotely thinking mechanically. I'm not thinking about anatomy and physiology and pushing parts around and micromanaging something. It is just this relationship with this intelligence, with an understanding that like the intelligence in my being in relationship with the intelligence in my client's being, that interaction of intelligences will bring the resources that will allow this system to resolve whatever the pathology is on its own.
Right.
Right.
And this is a hard thing for people to understand, and I've fought, a lot in my career to not become the guru, because I think that's, people. It's funny. People are willing to make the jump from, this Western model of thinking about, putting into a system and doing all these things. They'll make the jump all the way over to magic. They're okay with that. They want us to be magic, right? In some ways. And what I try to help people understand is that this innate intelligence that you're talking about is the magic, and our two, intelligences combining with, our skill set, our knowledge. I mean, I think people don't realize that, as craniosacral therapists, we are obsessed with, understanding the physiological body down to the cellular material and beyond. It's like that is what we spend all this time thinking, so that when we're interacting with somebody and working with something that comes up, in their bodies, that we're present for the potential of all these kinds of things that it could possibly be. And I think you put it very well, that our two intelligences are basically just coming together, and they're going to do the work in some ways.
Yeah, exactly. And I like, being a clinician, we understand from a first person perspective that there isn't necessarily anything like magic, the kind of negative connotation of that.
Right.
And there isn't even necessarily something that's like energy work. Some people are fine with that, and I'm fine with that as a model, but I'll just say for myself, and I guess I will say for my students who I taught, because I would also try and, disavow them of having a magical or a energetic perspective, because I know that there's a there. That, there is a, and again, I'll say intelligence, that we have that in our, within the lexicon of craniosacral therapy. There is this idea of an intelligence, and we talk about it. So we, in that sense that we have kind of concepts and words for it, opens up our experience.
Right.
But you can have the directness of it. Like, it's not fuzzy. There's no black box that in between me and what's happening. I'm aware of what's happening. The challenge is communicating that to people who don't have a concept.
And the language is always the challenge. And I just recently was trying to explain my work a little bit more to a friend who I've known for a long time, and he sort of trusts me. Like, he sort of knows that I'm not going to put up with just whatever wild idea somebody has, that I need to sort of understand it. And I was trying to help him just understand where we start from the craniosacral perspective is really kind of looking at fluid motion and forces, but that is the whole of the universe. These kind of forces at play, and how they're always in response to some other forces, and we're trying to kind of figure out how we can get those forces to align for good, right? I mean, it's like a lot of times they've been either, for whatever reason, they've kind of gotten into a bad behavioral pattern of sorts, and we're trying to help guide that back towards something without too much force. And that's this whole concept of forces for people who would don't think about medicine in that way, or even just the idea of being a clinician or a researcher or something, carries this whole ego identity piece to it that I just have no interest in. Like that, I'm every relationship that I'm in a clinical setup, whether it's like you and I are working with a patient together, or just me and one-on-one with a patient, is really just about the dynamic of that relationship and where it can go. And sometimes, I can get it to a certain point, and then I'm like, okay, I really think the next thing would be to see what happens if I put you together with this other, person, or this other kind of, treatment.
Yeah.
Right? It feels like there are just forces at play that are sort of, innately going to happen or not. That's the other part.
Yeah. So this brings me back to the kind of a bit of the launching point for this, because you asked about like the measurement side.
Yeah.
And so in part, the referring somebody out is for clinicians who can do this. So as you mentioned, the ego thing, right? There's plenty of providers out there who think they can do everything and they have the fix for everything. And then fortunately there's a subset of people who are like, no, I'm good at what I'm good at, and I'm not good at what I'm not good at.
Yeah.
And what I want to do for my client is get them to the person who has the answer to them, for their system. And if the sooner in the process,
or the next piece, sometimes is the way I think about it.
Yeah, and sometimes it's the next piece, because healing is a journey, and,
right.
and I might have a part to play in somebody's journey.
Yeah.
But the sooner I can realize in my interaction with the client that I don't have what they need, I want them to move on to the best of my ability, the person who might have what they need.
Yeah.
And I'll say part of that is, part of it is just those of us who work in these areas. There's all kinds of whatever we want to call luck, kismet, karma. I don't know. Like, I don't know how I ended up in a room with somebody who would become, my teacher and mentor for 6 years in craniosacral therapy, right? But I did,
right.
And took advantage of that opportunity, which I could have said no. Believe me, I tried to say no to like one of my people. Was like, no, I don't. I've been through 5 years of training. I don't need to do another. And my friend kept saying, oh, but you've not done this. And I was like, I have. So, and fine, I knuckled under and I went, and I was like, oh yeah, you're right. This is a whole new understanding and perspective, and it resonates for me, and off it went as a whole new tangent.
Yeah.
But as a clinician, like, I have certain aptitudes, right? So there's certain ways that I'm able to listen to a system and kind of understand it and build a rapport. And then there's all the ways that I can't. And so that person, might, like, I don't get their system.
Mm-hmm.
So I do my best to say, well, I think you're going to do well with this clinician. I think you're going to fall into the systems they get.
Yeah.
And then, and maybe I'm right and maybe I'm wrong, but it is just to say, like, part of it is that. And I would say a part of it is that we have so little actual objective information about this that to some degree we're groping in the dark. Yeah. It's by luck and circumstance that we cobble together the skills that we have, and
that's I think that's it's attributed to our ability maybe to have developed an instinct at another level, because most of the time people are coming to you and me for things that they've already been to, a healthcare, in quotes, provider, and haven't had any success, and so they've hit the end of the line. Their PT coverage ran out or whatever it is, and they need something else. They're better than they were, but they're not full function or not optimized the way they'd like to be or whatever, and we have had to learn, an instinct for, and I think this is very, woo to a lot of people, but I think these people get drawn to something at a certain point where they're like, I'm willing to go to another place with somebody and try something, or even just, and I think this is very strange sometimes, but I think people get stuck in their own healing process maybe more than it is that it's the problem with the treatment, because I'll get people who've been to neurologists and PT, and they've had every scan in the world done, and they get on my table for one craniosacral session, and their knee doesn't hurt anymore, and you can see it in their eyes, and they're I'm looking for different kinds of symmetries across parts of their bodies, and it's balanced again, and I'm like, in one session that doesn't seem like it should happen, but the thing is, it happens to me all the time now, and I don't expect it to happen either. Like I'm pretty good at managing that expectation. I think there are a lot of times where, I've had a string of successes, and then I bump up against something that I'm like, this seemed like an easy case, and it's not going the way I thought it would. So, it gets back to this, part of this partnership that you have with somebody, and whether or not those intelligence are working well together, or whatever it is.
So yes to all of that. The and that I'd like to add on is what we see happen, and I mean, there's an entire history of this, but it is also unfolding in this very space right now, which is as we're get better and better at measuring things and understanding them in a kind of somewhat more of an objective way, we get more potent at our ability to interact with them and get the result we want. So, and my best example of this in the space we're talking about is like my craniosacral training taught me that it was possible to access, say, the embryological field and let's say to heal an arm, right? Or even more, not just heal an arm that's there, but there's an achy elbow, but like somebody who's missing an arm. And in theory, I should be able to access the embryological field and initiate the algorithm for growing an arm, right? Now, 100% that exists within craniosacral, all of that, right? All kinds of people talk about it and philosophize and theorize about it, but nobody does it, right? And that's the big thing. And then in acupuncture, in Chinese medicine, there's also the same kind of hypothesis that this is possible. There's legend and lore about the ancient Chinese medicine, practitioners that could regrow a limb, but I don't know any of them today. Like, I don't know any of them in the world today that can do it on demand, right? And so maybe the stories are true, but somebody lost an important piece of knowledge. So that these things exist solidly in the storied narrative of these traditions. But then for me, where this directly connects to Michael Levin's work is he's done it. He now can do it on demand, repeatedly, all day long.
You're right.
Right? So it is not a hypothesis or a theory or one time I once got this frog to grow an extra toe. It's like, no. So that to me is like, that's the value of the studying and the measuring and the understanding is because now it can be done repeatedly. We understand it on like three-dimensional world, this world, right, grounded, and I feel the same thing will happen and does happen, has happened, say, in our field, as Andrew Still, kind of the first kind of concretization of craniosacral therapy, osteopathy,
the founder of
the
grandfather of, or whatever you call it. As more practitioners
under him spent more time and refined this, out of osteopathy, you had osteopathy in the cranial field and Sutherland. And then people who learned from Sutherland got better and better and better. And then you have James Jellis and biodynamic craniosacral. And he brought in a whole nother level of refinement of understanding. And so there is this process of like getting better and better and better. And so like that will happen in our field. But again, I look at what's happening in bioelectric medicine, and they're doing the thing that has been theorized for thousands of years, but near as we can tell, nobody could do it. Now it's being done. And that's the measuring. And where I want to take this in terms of just a little bit of again, just bring it a little more nuts and bolts, is so in my clinic, when we use our equipment to measure, and so let's talk about, so again, from the traditions, pranayama, breath work, love it, huge fan of it. If you just say to somebody, well, do some pranayama, it'll be good for your blood pressure, sort of, maybe they get some help, maybe they don't, who knows, but there's a whole area of study of heart rate variability breathing,
Mm-hmm.
where we can measure the cardiac rhythm, the respiratory rhythm, and the barrel reflex. So
Yeah.
we can use these three measurable biometrics, and we can take somebody through a series of breathing exercises, and we can look for when those three systems come into harmony functionally, physiologically. Not harmony as in some,
Yeah.
new age idea of harmony, or, planetary alignments, and, but just
But balance.
literally the systems come into sync with one another, and we can read it out objectively with the equipment. And then we have what we call a resonant frequency. So the resonant frequency of breathing is when a person breathes at this rate, their cardiac rhythm, their respiratory rhythm, and their barrel reflex synchronize, and their autonomic nervous system moves into more of a rest and digest, balanced
Recovery,
sympathetic relationship. And so it's the specificity, right? So let's say a person's resonant frequency is 5.7, right? That person might be a long time meditator, and I'm thinking of a particular client right now, long time meditator, breath work, does all kinds of things on that side, but has a blood pressure that is concerningly high, and none of that has brought it down. We do the resonant frequency determination. We find out that their resonant frequency is 5.7. We set them up to breathe at 5.7 breaths per minute. That's what we're pacing them at. So, and immediately their blood pressure starts dropping. So now that's great. When they breathe at that rate, their blood pressure drops. Now we train them to breathe at that rate, 20 minutes a day, and then we have a whole process we take them through. But what we see is the intelligence of the system learns how to regulate blood pressure. And now this same person has essentially a normal blood pressure for age and gender and height and weight and everything. They have a normal blood pressure. And that was simply by doing the resonant frequency breathing.
So I have a question, I wonder if you can posit this in any way, but just curious on the theoretical part of that.
Yeah.
Why do you think those two things could be? Is there an effort or ease challenge in someone like that who's like their blood pressure is working super hard in one direction as they're trying to like calm their system? Are their efforts working against each other? Why would that be out of sync?
So why is their blood pressure high and resistant to? Yeah.
While that number seems like pretty low.
Yep. So for this person, I would say likely it's early life trauma. Okay. And then really an adult life that has been a very common narrative of what you see when somebody has the ACEs score, the adverse childhood experiences. Yeah. So we know predictively that people who have a significant or high ACEs have all kinds of poor outcomes.
Do you use that in the clinic at all?
We do.
Okay. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And we find it's a very reliable metric.
Okay.
And needs to be actually expanded.
Probably.
Yeah. But anyways, so the system is really primed for suboptimal autonomic nervous system function. Yeah. Right? There's all kinds of reasons, compromises in the system, that intelligence has been compromised due to life experience. Yeah. And so what we see is so just doing breathing exercises, like generic breathing exercises, wasn't changing that system. The system was too lost to be found by just something that was generically in the vicinity. Yeah. But by finding that resonant frequency, so a more powerful influence in the system, that was enough of an attractor to attract that intelligence
That's really interesting.
into the conversation,
Yeah.
remind that intelligence of what its original job was, regulating the whole organism.
Yeah.
But in this case we're looking at blood pressure, but this isn't limited to blood pressure, but that's our window into it is blood pressure. So we're able to bring that intelligence back, repattern it, and now it's just naturally doing what it was always meant to do, but got interfered with because of early life circumstances that impinged on that system.
Yeah.
That intelligence was not very intelligent,
Yeah.
but the potential was always there. So this is, again, an area where you take something like pranayama, been around in the traditions, I love it, there's a ton of good about it, but by doing Western science, we can say to somebody, for this reason, not all these other reasons, but for these reasons, breathing like this is most likely to give you a positive, clinical outcome.
Right. Right.
And we see this across the board. I mean, with kids with GI issues, resonant frequency breathing, often it just handles it.
Yeah.
They don't need to be put on regimens of probiotics and prebiotics and restrictive diets. And there are cases where that's true.
Yeah.
But if we just take the bell curve, in clinics, in pediatric clinics who use this technology, they have a high rate of success for children with GI issues of getting them out of that by regulating their autonomic nervous system, restoring the self-regulatory mechanism. They're good to go, right? Yeah. So this idea of regulating, interacting with the intelligence and restoring the intelligence of the inherent mechanism, we can actually largely get out of the way and just let the system take it from there.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I know I've kept you a long time here, but but maybe if we can just kind of wrap this by talking a little bit about the regenerative part that happens with, say, something like a concussion, TBI, something of that sort.
Sure.
You can be brief about it, but I feel like we've basically set up everything that relates to that. So.
Yeah. So when it comes to the brain, and we'll talk specifically about TBI, but I'm going to give you my general. What we say in the clinic is we don't treat conditions and symptoms. We regulate dysregulation, and we very much could just say what we just talked about is there's an intelligence that has lost the plot, and we want to restore the intelligence. Yeah. But in the brain, the language is more dysregulation. And whether that dysregulation came from a concussion, which can happen, concussions can be mild and still have, behavioral, cognitive, but also we forget that, or it doesn't get talked about enough, that one of the most common symptoms of concussion is actually autonomic dysregulation.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So the energy system, the digestive system, the hormone system, these are much more common, but everybody thinks about the cognitive side.
But that's the regulation of every action in the body, and hormones are, both our energy systems and, everything that's going to help every function work. So
correct. Yep. Yeah. So if you have a concussion, again, it can be a mild concussion where a person is like, I'm fine, it was nothing, I slipped, fell, banged my head, I was fine, or a minor car accident where there's just a mild whiplash and the person's like, I'm fine. But those actually can produce TBIs. And then, of course, there's all the ones we think about, the sports, hockey, football, all of those serious car accidents. So although force matters, it does not have to be a high force for there to be a TBI. Right? That's the thing is, and the brain is such an integrated system. You can get one small part that gets dysregulated, and it can share that dysregulation across the whole brain. Yeah. And that's the tricky thing with brains. They're highly redundant and recursive, so multiple redundant systems, so that they can sustain an injury and go on as if everything is fine.
Right.
Or they can sustain a small injury and it can disrupt large-scale functions because it was just the right thing in the right place, and it gets echoed through the brain. So concussion, the whole area of concussion is fascinating.
Yeah, and the language I've heard around it. I've been practicing craniosacral work for 26 plus years, but I feel like the language during the time of my tenure has really changed in terms of like thinking about neural networks, or kind of thinking about it more from a computer-based standpoint, right? Where we thought, well, if we cut off this network, you no longer have access to that. That doesn't, you can't rebuild that network. It's that network is ruined, and now it's going to have to figure out a long workaround, and that could happen, or it might not happen. But I feel like what you're presenting is more the reality of what I've seen too, which is that sometimes it can be something very small. And I think we saw this around COVID too, with some of the brain foggy stuff that's going on, and realizing, well, there could be a neurolymphatic element to it and all these other parts. But that, we don't know also the whole story of this person and this person's epigenetic line as to why that little injury or little bump on the head seemed to have this big impact, whereas somebody else went through the windshield, got up off the ground, and seemed to not have any major impact. And it goes to show, back to that sort of autonomic conversation that we're having, or 1+1 trauma can equal many more. We never know what that earlier thing was sometimes.
Correct. And we kind of pack into the word resilience all of everything you just said, right? We pack into this word resilience,
Yes.
and we say, well, we don't know how resilient the system is.
Right.
And
that's
in
a great
some
word
ways,
for it too.
Yeah, and in some ways we could take the idea of resilience, which is really, again, we've tend to reduce that down to resources like water, hydration, minerals, energy, mitochondrial, whatever, emotional resilience, willpower. Like we've made it as if there's like a thing, right, that you don't have enough of. Mm-hmm. It's a tank that you could fill. And if we reach back to our conversation about intelligence and really think about resilience in the sense of the intelligence of the system, and how much has that intelligence been compromised? And so if you have a series of small insults that just chip away at your intelligence function, then you kind of have that tipping point. Here comes a concussion, and the system just doesn't have the onboard intelligence to resolve this new conundrum, right? And then that's what you're left with is that situation. And so, for us, what we would do is, typically we would do neurofeedback, and neurofeedback would be about restoring the network, and networks plural, or the intelligence function of the brain. And as we restore that, we find the brain then sorts these problems out on its own. Like you restore its ability to self-optimize, and then it does.
Yeah.
And so that's largely our approach to TBI is restore the global function and let the brain micromanage where it needs more of whatever. Yeah.
And I believe you have some, for people who are more interested in what these devices look like, what does the process look like. You have some videos on the website, correct, for Bhakti?
They do, yeah. So they can look at, so we've got a couple of sites, so Bhakti Brain Health Clinic, that'll have a more kind of research type information.
Okay.
Our Tech for Brains, and so it's the number 4, so Tech, the number 4 brains, Tech for Brains. That's all of our devices.
Okay.
And then another site that kind of has all of it together is my cerebralfit.com.
Okay.
So cerebral is in the brain, cerebralfit.com.
Okay.
There they'll find mountains of research and talks on all of these things that we've talked about here today and more. plus all the devices. So lots of resources
And
there.
I'll throw those in the show notes. So, for anybody who's listening, if you go down on your app, you can find links to all these things right within the app too. But we'll have it up on a podcast website. And when I post this, I'll have some other links for you people to check out. Well, I feel like we could have gone on for hours, and maybe this is just a part one, and we need to do more. But I still haven't been down to the clinic, so. And your clinic is less than a mile from where I live, so
let's make that happen.
We'll make it happen soon.
Yeah, it's been a delight, and it's both fun to just kind of intellectually explore all this territory, but it's certainly a delight to talk to a fellow practitioner that knows the space of the cranial world, and has visited it. It adds a whole layer of intelligence, right? That we can have like a whole conversation that, again, most of the audience was like, what are they talking about? Like totally lost the plot.
If they're listening to my podcast, they've heard some of this language before, so it's not new. And but part of this podcast has been to expand the the notions of where healing comes from, and I sort of understand our existence and just what the potentials are too. I think sometimes people get sort of stuck into a way of thinking about something, and this just kind of helps to open doors and windows and be like, oh, it's much bigger than I was even considering. So you did all of that quite well today.
Well, thank you, and keep up the good work.
Thank you. Thanks, Guy.
It's been fun.
Nice to be connected.
All right. Thank you.